The first thing you hear isn't the scream, it's the thud. It's that sickening, hollow sound a skull makes when it meets something unforgiving, something dense and heavy, something usually reserved for turning soil. Picture it, midnight black pressing against the plate glass of a suburban home in Ozark, Missouri. The kind of place where the biggest scandal is usually an HOA violation. But tonight, beneath the veneer of manicured lawns and automatic sprinklers, a truly primal terror is unfolding. We're inside the head of Carolyn Alling, 65 years young, a woman who smelled faintly of mint and expensive hand cream, who collected antique buttons and kept her husband's favorite brand of cheap beer on ice. But right now, Carolyn's world is a kaleidoscope of pain and a desperate internal monologue that goes something like this. He's my son. He can't. Not over this. Not over the money. This isn't a quick slash in the dark. This is an explosion of rage that has been building for weeks, years even, pressurized by a sense of toxic entitlement and the bitter certainty that the world, starting with his own mother, owed him everything. And that's where we meet Derrick Alling, a man whose handsome features have been warped into a mask of pure, unadulterated greed. 39 years old, living off a threadbare inheritance promise, a man who saw his mother not as family, but as a bank vault with a heartbeat. The implement? It wasn't a sleek, silver murder weapon from a movie. It was a grubbing hoe, a short-handled, heavy-bladed garden tool. Iron, earthy, brutal. It had been sitting innocently in the garage waiting for spring planting until Derrick picked it up. "You really thought you could hide it from me, didn't you, Mom?" Derrick's voice was low, a gravelly whisper that was almost more chilling than a shout. He wasn't panting. He wasn't shaking. It was chillingly methodical. Carolyn's eyes were wide, pleading with a monster sheet raised. She tried to roll away, the plush, floral carpet scraping against her cheek, leaving a burn she didn't even register. The thud you heard? That was the third strike. The first two had been enough to incapacitate her, to flood her vision with static, but the third was the one that truly shattered the silence and the delicate bone structure beneath. For weeks, Carolyn knew this moment was coming. She was smart, a licensed dental hygienist by trade. She was a meticulous planner. She hadn't just been passively enduring his escalating demands. She'd been recording them. Hidden in a hollowed-out ceramic owl on the mantelpiece, right there in the living room where he was standing over her, was a small digital recorder. Tapes filled with Derrick's violent threats, his venomous rants about the trust fund, the piece of paper that stood between him and the comfort he believed was rightfully his. He had called her a liar, a thief, a selfish old woman. He had said, "You think you're going to keep it all, Mom? Watch me." And yet, despite the recordings, despite the fear, she had delayed calling the police. That insidious, toxic hope, the mother's hope, that her son, her baby, would somehow snap out of it, that he would remember the quiet boy who used to bring her dandelions. Now, as the blood bloomed into a dark, viscous stain on the carpet, Carolyn knew the hope was dead. The last thing she felt wasn't pain, but a profound regret that her own love had been the thing that signed her death warrant. Derrick stood over her, breathing through his nose, the hoe dripping. His inheritance. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the power, the final terrifying exertion of dominance. He wanted the house, the savings, the dental practice retirement fund. He wanted it all, and he wanted it now. He dragged her, a brutal, scraping sound that cut through the silence, back through the hallway, past framed photos of a happier family, and into the detached guest house, the perfect little crime scene annex. He had done it. He was a killer. And the realization gave him a terrible, cold rush. But he had missed one critical detail. The ceramic owl on the mantelpiece was silent, but a small, hidden light on its belly was still blinking. It had recorded everything: the verbal abuse, the threats, and that final, sickening thud. The clock on the wall read 9:35 p.m. The first call to the Christian County Sheriff's Office would come a few hours later, a quiet request for a welfare check from a concerned husband who hadn't heard from his wife all day. He knew her routine. She was meticulous. This was wrong. This is the kind of case, the kind of betrayal that chills you to the bone. It shows you the darkest corner of the human heart, where the love of money truly becomes the root of all evil. It's not just a murder. It's a terrifying lesson in greed. If you're captivated by stories of family secrets and shocking betrayals, hit that subscribe button right now. We dive into the true crime that makes you question everything. The cool night air of Ozark was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the slow, weary approach of two Christian County deputy cruisers. When they rolled up to the address on Haylett Drive, the house was dark, quiet, almost aggressively peaceful. Too quiet. The call had come in from Carolyn's husband, her second husband, the stepfather to Derrick, a man worried sick because his wife hadn't returned a single call all day. He knew her routine. She was meticulous. This was wrong. Deputy Miller and Deputy Jones, both seasoned officers, stepped onto the manicured lawn. The scent of pine and freshly cut grass was thick in the air. This place looked like a postcard, but sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest secrets. They knocked. Silence. They knocked again, harder. And then the door opened, revealing Derrick Alling.
Now, picture this scene. Derrick is 39, but he has the slumped posture and shifty eyes of a teenager caught skipping class. He's wearing a dark, slightly stained t-shirt, and there's a flicker in his eyes that Miller immediately reads as something unnatural. He's too calm, too vacant. His body language screams rehearsed. "We're here for a welfare check on Carolyn Alling, sir," Deputy Miller said, his hand resting instinctively on his holster. "Oh, Mom," Derrick mumbled, scratching his arm. His answer was a study in evasiveness. "She's around. She must be out." Deputy Jones cut in, leaning slightly forward, his gaze fixed on Derrick's slightly dilated pupils. "She hasn't returned her husband's calls all day, Mr. Alling. Where is she?" Derrick hesitated. That hesitation, that tiny, agonizing pause, was everything. It confirmed the deputy's growing gut feeling that Sheriff Brad Cole would later talk about. They knew, right then, that they weren't dealing with a missing person. They were dealing with a situation. They pressed him. They weren't aggressive, just relentless. They asked if she was okay. Derrick stayed silent. They asked, point blank, if he knew if she was alive. That's when the carefully constructed wall around Derrick Alling cracked. I don't think so," he finally whispered. It was the most damning 4 words he could have spoken. The game was over. "Where is she, Derrick?" Miller demanded, his voice dropping an octave, losing all pretense of being friendly. "The guest house, out back." What the deputies found moments later was a scene of such senseless, concentrated brutality that it instantly elevated the case from a domestic dispute to a horrifying act of first-degree murder. Carolyn Alling's body was in the detached guest cottage, a space meant for quiet relaxation, now completely violated. She had been beaten beyond recognition. The severity of the trauma to her head and face told the entire sickening story, a frenzy of violence fueled not by passion, but by cold, focused hate. The medical examiner would later confirm multiple skull fractures. The blood was everywhere, a macabre signature on the pristine white walls. And then they found the murder weapon. Tucked away next to the small cottage, half hidden beneath a blue tarp, was the grubbing hoe. It was still wet, caked with a mixture of dark Missouri earth and something far, far worse. As Derrick was being cuffed, Still eerily quiet, still scratching his arm, the stepfather arrived, pulling up in a flurry of dust and frantic worry. He took one look at the tape, one look at the pale faces of the deputies, and his knees buckled. But amid his grief, he provided the critical missing piece of the puzzle. He told the deputies everything: the trust fund, the inheritance, the weeks of escalating threats. He revealed how he and Carolyn had been forced to keep their marriage a secret for fear of Derrick's violent reaction if he found out. This wasn't a sudden burst of anger. It was the final devastating act of a prolonged campaign of financial abuse and terror. Derrick Alling hadn't just murdered his mother, he had executed a calculated plan for profit. The deputies realized they hadn't just found a body, they had found the end result of pure, naked avarice. It wasn't just a gardening tool, it was the instrument of a killer who believed his entitlement was worth more than his own mother's life. If the calculated brutality of this crime has you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Let us know in the comments if you've ever suspected someone close to you of having a dark secret. Keep watching, because the full, chilling story is far from over. The Ozark night, which had started so deceptively quiet, was now a swarm of flashing blue and red lights. Crime scene tape glowed ominously against the dark houses, and the quiet neighborhood was now the epicenter of a horrific secret. Derrick Alling was gone, transported to the Christian County Jail, leaving behind the gruesome puzzle that forensics teams were now meticulously documenting. But the physical evidence, the blood, the hoe, the fractured skull, was only half the story. The real horror lay in the audio files that detectives soon recovered, not from a fancy high-tech device, but from that unassuming ceramic owl sitting on the mantelpiece. Picture this: two detectives sitting in a sterile police briefing room, listening to the final, terrifying weeks of Carolyn Alling's life. The recordings were raw, unedited, a crushing testament to the slow, emotional torture she endured at the hands of her own son. "You think you're smart, Mom, hiding it away?" Derrick's voice would snarl from the speakers, dripping with venom that made the detectives flinch. "That money is mine. It's my birthright. You keeping it from me is stealing, pure and simple." The detectives heard Carolyn's weary, pleading responses. "Derrick, we've talked about this. It's a trust. It has conditions. I can't just hand over everything. You need to get a job. You need to..." And then the explosion. "Job? I don't need a job. I need what's owed to me. If you think you're going to use this trust fund to punish me, you've got another thing coming. You won't live to spend a dime of it, Mom. Watch me." That was the recurring threat, the dark cloud that hung over every recorded conversation. You won't live to spend a dime of it. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a promise, and he kept it. These recordings didn't just establish a motive of inheritance and greed, they painted a detailed picture of premeditation and a sustained campaign of psychological warfare. The conversation wasn't a back and forth, it was an echo chamber of Derrick's entitlement and Carolyn's agonizing fear and residual love fighting a losing battle. This is where the story of the secret marriage comes in, and it adds another heartbreaking layer of betrayal. Carolyn had recently married her second husband, the man who called in the welfare check. They had been forced to keep their union entirely private. Why? Because Derrick, the obsessive architect of his mother's financial future, believed that if his mother remarried, the terms of the trust or his future share of her estate could be jeopardized. The stepfather told police, his voice breaking with guilt and grief, "We couldn't tell him. We had to keep it secret. We knew he'd go ballistic. We were terrified he'd act violently toward us if he found out." Carolyn and her husband were living a lie, forced into the shadows of their own life by a 39-year-old man who demanded full, tyrannical control. Meanwhile, in the guest house, the forensics team was meticulously cataloging the damage. The grubbing hoe, usually an innocuous symbol of hard work and cultivation, was now a nightmare object. The sheer weight and blunt force of the tool spoke to the brutality of the assault. They took samples, analyzed spatter patterns, and reconstructed the scene. The initial confrontation, the incapacitating blows, the brutal drag across the carpet. It was a crime of passionless, economic violence. Derrick Alling, sitting in a holding cell, was a hollow shell. When questioned, he offered only mumbled non-denials, occasionally scratching his arm, his mind seemingly already calculating how long it would take to access the money now that his primary obstacle was removed. He had murdered his mother for an inheritance he likely wouldn't see for decades, if ever, thanks to the very law he'd sought to bypass. A terrible, ironic, and final twist of fate. The evidence is mounting, pointing directly to calculated greed. If you're shocked by the lengths people will go for money, let me know your thoughts on Derrick's motive in the comments below. And stick around because the next segment reveals the shocking courtroom drama and the fate of the secret recordings.
The Christian County Courthouse became the new stage for this family tragedy. The details of Carolyn Alling's final moments, the grubbing hoe, the guest house, the sheer, calculated brutality sent a shockwave through the quiet Missouri community. Neighbors who had once waved to Derrick and Carolyn now gathered outside the courthouse, their faces grim, trying to reconcile the smiling young men in the family photos with the monster facing the judge. This is the phase of the story where the chilling evidence meets the cold reality of the legal system. Derrick Alling's arraignment was a spectacle. He was brought into the courtroom in a navy blue jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, his head bowed. But occasionally, he'd lift his chin, his eyes scanning the gallery for his family, specifically his stepfather, with a look that wasn't regret, but resentment. He was being punished, not for murder, but for being caught. The charges were read: first-degree murder and armed criminal action. The prosecutor was unrelenting, calling the crime a violent and gruesome execution rooted in avarice. The judge, having reviewed the initial filings and the documented history of threats, immediately ordered that Alling be held without bond. There was no question of his danger to the community or the shocking lack of remorse. The pretrial hearings focused almost entirely on the star witness, the ceramic owl, and the secret recordings. The prosecution, utilizing the tapes, laid out their case with devastating precision. They didn't just have a motive, they had Derrick's own voice, week after week, escalating his threats. They played snippets for the court, just short, chilling bursts, where his demands for the inheritance moved from spoiled petulance to outright violent intimidation. "You won't live to spend a dime of it," echoed in the tense silence of the courtroom. The defense, a stressed-out public defender, fought fiercely to have the recording suppressed. Their argument was technical, that Carolyn was a private citizen and that the tapes were made without Derrick's consent, violating his expectation of privacy. But the judge quickly dismissed the objection. These were recordings made by a terrified victim in her own home, documenting criminal threats against her life. They weren't an invasion of privacy, they were a cry for help that arrived too late. The audio evidence was allowed, sealing the fate of the family's secret. Then came the physical evidence, the grubbing hoe. It was presented in a sterile evidence bag, carefully tagged. The sheer, grotesque ordinariness of the murder weapon was deeply unsettling. The detective on the stand described the tool and the nature of the injuries. The descriptive language was clinical, but the effect on the gallery was visceral. This wasn't a quick bullet or a professional hit. It was a furious, prolonged attack with a garden implement driven solely by the demand for money. Throughout these proceedings, the emotional intensity was carried by Carolyn's friends and the stepfather seated in the front row. They weren't just watching a trial, they were watching the final, public degradation of a woman who was a licensed dental hygienist, a Missouri native, passionate about animals and beloved by her community. They had to sit through the cold legal analysis of her skull fractures, listening to the very voice that had tormented her, knowing she had been forced to keep her new marriage a secret to appease her unstable, entitled son. For them, justice wasn't just about a conviction, it was about honoring the life Carolyn had been forced to live, a life overshadowed by a dark shadow she desperately tried to love and protect right up until the end. This courtroom, packed with reporters and onlookers, was a monument to the ultimate betrayal, a son who valued an early inheritance more than his mother's life. The legal battle is underway, and the evidence against Derrick is nearly insurmountable. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the conclusion when the jury delivers its verdict and we reveal Derrick's final shocking days. We're getting close to the end, but the deepest suspense is still to come. The trial of Derrick Alling lasted 2 agonizing weeks, but the closing arguments felt like a swift, brutal final chapter. The prosecution simply replayed the chilling audio, the escalating threats, the entitlement, the cold, calculating voice of a man who saw murder as an eviction notice for his own mother. They showed the jury the grubbing hoe, the humble, ordinary tool of murder, and told them the weapon, combined with the audio tape, spelled out premeditation without a shadow of a doubt. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. The courtroom was electric with tension when the foreman finally stood. Derrick, pale and fidgeting, didn't look at his own counsel. He looked at the floor, already convinced of the cosmic injustice of his situation. On the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find? Guilty. The word cracked the silence. The same verdict followed for armed criminal action. Guilty. A wave of relief, quickly followed by quiet sobs, swept through the gallery where the stepfather and Carolyn's friends sat. Justice, cold and heavy, had finally arrived. Derrick's reaction wasn't sorrow or fear or even rage. It was a blank, entitled disbelief. When he was later sentenced to life in prison, a punishment that ensured he would never, ever touch the inheritance he had killed for, he reportedly focused his anger not on the murder, but on the logistics. He'd thrown his life away, not for millions, but for the promise of money he'd never get, proving his avarice was a bottomless, self-destructive force. The story ends not with a grand revelation, but with the tragic certainty that a mother's love, the kind that tries to protect, to hope, and to secretly record the violent path her son was on, was ultimately no match for the darkest kind of human greed. The ceramic owl, the unlikely witness, will forever stand as the symbol of a devastating betrayal in the quiet heart of Missouri. The inheritance Derrick Alling craved is now locked in legal limbo, a cruel, ironic prize for a killer. This case is a terrifying reminder that some of the worst secrets are kept behind the most ordinary suburban doors. It proves that money, when mixed with toxic entitlement, can turn a son into a monster. If this story of brutal betrayal and dark suspense has left you speechless, share this video right now. And don't forget to comment below with your thoughts. Do you think the inheritance should be legally forfeited to charity? We want to hear your take on this shocking case of greed and murder. Click that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the true crimes that haunt us all.